The SD Ruby podcast is brought to you by New Relic.
Hi everybody, my name is James Miller. I'm here tonight to talk a little bit about RubyMotion. Are there any iOS developers in the room? Anyone tinkering, putzing with it? Has anybody, how many people have heard of RubyMotion first? Awesome, okay. Has anybody played with RubyMotion? Cool, not too many. So, I'm James. A guy named Laurent Sansonetti, he was a developer that worked at Apple. He worked on the MacRuby project. Has anybody played with MacRuby at all? So MacRuby was made several years ago now. It's a framework that allows you to write Objective-C Cocoa applications for the Mac platform in what's essentially Ruby. And one of the biggest things that people asked for was, well, when can I develop for iOS? People write a lot more apps for iOS than they do for just the straight Mac platform. So about a year ago, I think, he left Apple. He literally disappeared for a while. People couldn't get a hold of him for even merging pull requests into MacRuby. He totally disappeared, and then he just came back to life and started a startup that released RubyMotion, which allowed people to suddenly write iOS apps using what's very, very similar to MacRuby. And from the work that he's done, now that he's back alive and well, he does plan to contribute pieces of his work back into MacRuby in the future. So the reason that you might want to look at an alternative to Objective-C and the current way of writing iOS apps, actually the first one that I put up here is Objective-C. A lot of people just don't dig the language. The syntax can be kind of a pain. In the end, though, you're really not going to get away from Objective-C here. So the third-party libraries that you're going to use with RubyMotion, they're still written in Objective-C. You're still going to need to read the Apple documentation for the APIs that you're going to use, which are all methods that are written in Objective-C. So RubyMotion adds a nice syntax that that comes from MacRuby that adds a little bit of sanity to the Objective-C syntax, but it doesn't get rid of it entirely. Probably the biggest pain point is Xcode. I don't know how many of you are familiar with using Xcode. It's infuriating most of the time, for me anyway. You're forced into it. You don't have any choices if you're writing Objective-C. If you want to build, if you want to compile and run a Mac app or an iOS app, you want to run it on your device, you want to build an archive to submit to the App Store, you have to use Xcode. And I personally develop on an 11-inch MacBook Air, and there's just so much Chrome in Xcode that I feel like I can't get anything done. I have to bump up the font, and then I can see nothing. Plus, Objective-C syntax is so long that I end up having just one method on my entire screen, which is less than useful. There are tons of dialogue, configuration menus for setting up your builds, and it's tough, and it takes a lot of time to learn. Occasionally, it just crashes on you, and so anyway, that's my biggest gripe with writing apps previously. So now we'll get into what RubyMotion is. Don't worry about not being able to see that code. So RubyMotion is a port of MacRuby for iOS. It is its own Ruby implementation. It's written on top of the Objective-C runtime, and the foundation classes. It's the easiest Ruby version you'll ever install up here because I swear, I mean, people dealing with RVM issues, RubyM, whatever you're using, this guy's having trouble this evening, maybe even as we speak.
I conquered it.
All right, good work. And this is just a installer that works perfectly every time, and you don't even have to think about it. So there are some alternatives to writing iOS apps other than using Xcode and using the Apple sanctioned ways of writing them. One of them is Phonegap. There's another one, Appcelerator or Titanium. I'm not sure which one's the company, which one's the product, but what they do is they let you write the app in JavaScript. For the most part, HTML, CSS, and then they'll give you a set of APIs. So you're reading their docs, and they'll give you a set of APIs where you can do certain things and create what's sort of a semi-native app. So they'll compile it for you, and a lot of times what you get is code put in a web view, so it doesn't feel native. You can kind of tell. It also, they make it so that it can compile to like 7 different platforms. So that's really their goal there. They're not really trying to give you just what Apple has to offer. You lose quite a bit on performance with Phonegap and the others. With RubyMotion, it is actually truly native. You're writing Ruby code that's actually getting compiled directly into machine code on the Objective-C runtime. It's completely concurrent. There's no global interpreter lock. This is not MRI Ruby. This is similar to JRuby, Rubinius, where you can use all the processors that you have available to you. It supports Apple's Grand Central Dispatch. Probably the toughest thing to get used to is that it's statically compiled. So I'm going to get into some of the limitations that comes with. MacRuby doesn't have that limitation. It's a device limitation that Apple has on their devices. So MacRuby uses just-in-time compilation, whereas the devices need to have everything statically compiled. The biggest goal that Lauren had when he made it was to make sure everything is fully App Store compliant. So you're never going to get, he says that you're never going to submit an app to the App Store that's going to get rejected because of RubyMotion. If you're leaking memory all over the place and just writing poor code that performs poorly, that could get rejected, or if you're not following the rules, that could get rejected, but it's not going to be something fundamental to RubyMotion that's going to get you denied. Memory management is automatic. It's similar to Arc, which was added, I think, in iOS 5 and has been on the Mac side for a little while now, but it is not exactly the same. You actually had to write custom memory management. Okay, limitations. So there are a couple limitations that we are used to in Ruby that you cannot use currently in RubyMotion. One of them is require. So because everything is statically compiled, you can't require anything at runtime. They have to be available at build time. So this means that Ruby gems, they don't work. You can't just include a standard Ruby gem. Like, you can't just add will paginate to your iOS app. It won't work that way. There are ways to build gems that will work with RubyMotion, but and there are some great ones out there already, but the normal regular Ruby gems will not work. Eval is not supported because you're dynamically evaluating code. That doesn't work. Similarly, defined method is not supported. Now, both of these, he said in a podcast that I listened to that he hopes to be able to add these back. He wasn't sure about Apple's policies on running code on the interpreting code on the device. He thinks that he can, and he probably will, but his goal was to make it so that apps never get rejected because of him. So right now, eval, define method are removed. The binding method on the proc object is removed because of performance reasons. I believe it's removed from JRuby as well for the same reason. And other than that, it pretty much conforms to Ruby spec as far as I know. So the one thing that you get with Xcode that you do not get with RubyMotion is autocomplete. I found that this is a challenge at first when you're first playing around with RubyMotion. You have to copy a lot of Objective-C methods and then rewrite them in Ruby. So you just grab the method name, which is long and has the object types and all that stuff, and you can condense it into a simpler def Ruby method. You get the hang of it after a while, but there is definitely some copy pasting, and it's pretty tough to avoid if you're wanting to use your favorite IDE. Standard library is not included, so even stuff that you get from the time class, CSV, all the other stuff that's in the standard library, Ruby is not available. The debugger, it's not, like I said there, it's not great yet, but it's a priority for Lawrence, so he's saying that it's going to improve. And I mean, we're talking technology here that's just a couple months old, and apps are already in the App Store that use it. So it's maturing quickly, and while I say the debugger isn't great, it works. It's fine. So some of the language benefits that we get with RubyMotion. Wow, can you guys read that at all? It doesn't really matter. Okay, so he actually added a little piece to Ruby syntax. So with Objective-C, we have named parameters. So the method name up there is table view did select row at index path. So you kind of say the method names in Objective-C. And so we have this parameter here that is named. And there isn't really any way to do that in regular Ruby. So what Lauren did is he made it so that we have something very similar now. We have def table view, and then your arguments. Your first argument is unnamed, but it's essentially meant to be named by this. And then your second argument is did select row and index path, and then a colon, and then your argument here. So you can have another comma and as many named arguments as you need. So this is the same method defined in Ruby versus Objective-C. Calling a method, it's the same thing. So init with frame is the method, and it has one argument, or it has two arguments. The first is the frame, and the second argument is the style. This is kind of just a fun one that I threw in here. So, like a month ago, I was working on an Objective-C application, and I was working with Objective-C, and you can't just convert a string to base64 directly. You need an external library. So we have a nice little method on array called pack, and it's a piece of cake. So it's just a little sugar there. My biggest gripe by far with Objective-C is header files. I get stuck with them all the time. For some reason, I can't ever remember to do things in both places. And so here is exactly what you need to write in Ruby versus the Objective-C implementation over there. So we're just defining a single property defining a single getter and setter here in Ruby, and a property over there, and these are identical, kind of doing the exact same thing. You can mix and match Ruby and Objective-C. So you can see on top here, I'm doing A equals an array that contains just 1. And then I'm calling an Objective-C method, object at index, passing the first index, and so that equals 1. Similarly, I'm setting B with a Objective-C method, and then calling a Ruby method on it. So you can mix and match all you need. This isn't all that useful, but what is great is that you can import a Objective-C library as a vendored library and use it and call Ruby methods on it. The reason that this is like this is if you just call string.ancestors, so the class string calling its ancestors, seeing its hierarchy, it throws in all of Apple's class types in there. So you get all the methods that come with those classes. NS mutable string, NS string, NS object are all Apple. NS is next step, which is what Apple, it's where Objective-C kind of came from with the company that they bought a while ago, and they never changed it. You get enumerable, definitely my favorite module in all of Ruby. You can iterate as you're used to in Ruby over Objective-C objects. So just very useful. Pretty sweet feature that he added is a built-in read eval print loop. It's like Rails console for the iOS simulator. So you can actually, in the simulator, you can command click on something and it will highlight it, and then it will assign self to that object in the console, and you can interact with it, you can call methods on it. You could actually, so let's say you clicked on the UI view, that's your background view here, you could actually change the background color on the fly, and it would update in real time. You can't change your code and have it update in real time, you have to recompile, but you can change it live in the console. This is where, so it uses a rake-based command line tool. This is where getting out of Xcode is fantastic. To build your project, you type rake. To get it on your iPhone that you have connected, you type rake device. To get to make it show an iPad in the simulator instead of an iPhone, you do rake device equals, or rake simulator equals iPad, I think, or something like that. So it's just so much simpler than dealing with all the options that come with Xcode. To create an archive to send to the App Store, you type rake archive. So it simplifies things dramatically. So you can create a project, test it, run it, send it to the app, or send it to the device, or create an archive for the App Store, all from the command line. RubyMotion has testing built in. Everything Ruby has to be testable, or you really can't call it Ruby. It ships with something called MacBacon. It's RSpec-like. It's very RSpec-like. It's not straight RSpec, but it has all the basic matchers. Works pretty well. It is not fully there yet as far as testing all of your views. It's not quite there yet. And better functionality is coming soon. In fact, it came today. So he released a version today that lets you do some functional view and controller testing. So you can actually say, I want a label in my view that has the accessibility identifier called tap to start, should not be nil, and you can go way beyond. I mean, this opens up a whole bunch of new cool things for testing, but it just came out today, so I haven't really tried it. I only watched a little screencast on it, so I don't have a lot to say about it. Dependency management. We are all pretty used to Bundler now, and if you're a Ruby developer, and thankfully there's something similar for Objective-C. This is not RubyMotion specific, but RubyMotion does have it built in. There's a project called Cocoapods that allows us to just specify dependencies, and we do not have to vendor them and store the code for those dependencies in our Git repository. You just it'll add it to a vendor folder. You can ignore that vendor folder, and when you build your project, it'll pull down those dependencies, install them. You can specify versions, everything just like Bundler. So Bubble Wrap is something that was written by Matt Eminetti. He is not here tonight, but he is our MacRuby guru and had a lot of opinions and things to say about RubyMotion when it came out. And one of the things that he decided to do is create a library that's filled with wrappers, helpers that make the Cocoa APIs look more like Ruby. And there's like 500 watchers on GitHub, probably 30, 40 contributors to it. It's really turning out pretty awesome. A couple things, some examples of some things that you can do just a lot simpler than calling the Objective-C or the Apple Objective-C APIs. You can fetch a user's location, determine whether the device is an iPad, an iPhone, whether it's Retina, whether it's not. You can fetch things over HTTP, parse JSON, encode JSON, subscribe to notifications, configure Observer, stuff like that. And actually, just the other day, there's an event machine reactor that was added to it. So it's definitely the most complete event machine implementation I've seen for RubyMotion. If you're playing with RubyMotion, I definitely recommend that you add this to your project. There's really no reason not to, and it makes life easier. And if you have something to contribute that you're finding that you're writing every time you make an app, fork it and create a pull request. So to get started with RubyMotion, it's not free, it's a commercial product. It's a commercial product because he is looking for this to be around for more than 5 years. He doesn't just want it to be a sponsored thing that goes away. I think he's a bit jaded by what happened to MacRuby. They kind of just pulled it from the priority list and weren't really going to fund its continued development anymore. It's $100 to renew it, but so every year you can renew it. You don't have to renew it to keep the functionality that you currently have. You just have to renew it if you want the new stuff. You also, if you want to actually do anything with these apps, you're going to need an iOS developer license that allows you to run apps on your phone, on your iPad, and it also allows you to actually sell apps or push apps to the App Store. You need to install Xcode, ironically. You got to install Xcode and the command line tools in order to use it. That's all I got. Does anybody have any questions or anything?
I do.
Sure.
I'll do this for you.
I don't mind repeating the question either if you guys want to.
Do they offer can you download it and check it out for free, or do you have to pay the $199 just to check it out at all?
There are no trials. I don't know why.
Bastards.
There are no trials. Yeah.
And how do you feel the speed is comparative to MacRuby or to Objective-C Direct?
There is no difference. Yeah.
Next up will be market knowledge.
So you said you can't use, obviously you can't use Ruby gems, but is there, what about if you want to redistribute some RubyMotion code?
There isn't really a way. So right now, there's a lot of complaints that, okay, I have this enormous Objective-C app and I want to slowly chip away at it and move it to RubyMotion. Right now, you can't really do that. It's all or nothing. But what you can do is start a RubyMotion project and then use vendor Objective-C code. That's really the only way. You can't import other RubyMotion code at this point.
And Cocoapods, those are only for Objective-C.
Correct.
Right. But it uses Ruby to load the Objective-C.
Kind of, yeah. So it uses Rake actually to just pull them in, compile them. It talks to Xcode automatically to get them built, and sets all the flags that you need for your app, and it does all that automatically.
Oh.
Yeah. Hey.
This sort of overlaps with your question, but is there any effort to backport the static compiler to MacRuby?
I don't think so, because the static compiler makes things more difficult for the most part, because with MacRuby we have the availability of just in time, whereas the device is actually limiting us to static compilation. So what would be the reason that you'd want the static compiler?
Well, the most obvious thing I think of is that you could build executables that didn't need a bundle, basically. That you could just do like MacRuby-C, a file, like a Ruby file, and just get out like a command line tool or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Because right now you can include the MacRuby dialib or whatever, but if you wanted to actually embed MacRuby in a file, say.
So you're saying that you want the ability to run MacRuby on a computer that has MacRuby installed?
No, that has no MacRuby at all, and without a bundle. So,
Okay, I'm not sure.
okay,
I'm not sure.
but
Now, at our company, we have a lot of Objective-C code already in
Uh-huh.
libraries that's for data access and stuff like that. Can we still access those libraries from like in a RubyMotion GUI? So if we have a GUI that's calling back to that Objective-C code, is that possible?
So in your current Objective-C project, you're referencing other
And then
Objective-C frameworks?
Objective-C framework, yeah, it's in a
Yeah, so
library
that's what you do with that's what Cocoapods is for.
Okay.
So my example there, I was using AF networking, for example, is a networking library for pulling JSON down, parsing it, and all that stuff. So that is completely Objective-C, and I'm just using that in my RubyMotion project.
Okay, but you're not just strictly limited to the Apple libraries.
No, not at all. No. Yeah, that's just a random project that's up on GitHub.
Anybody else? Thanks, James.